All right. Hey guys, welcome to the video today. I've been very hesitant to make this video just because Empires, this board game I'm working on, has been changing and updating so much. Every month there's basically a new update. This is very much just a tutorial video for the date today, November 4th of 2023, all right? Welcome to Fate of Empires. If you ever wanted a tabletop role-playing board game where you could create a whole living, breathing world along with and even competitively against your friends, this is it. Empires, at the end of the day, is a player-made sandbox tabletop grand strategy war game with RPG elements. Now, if that sounds overwhelming, it's not, okay? It's just a board game like Risk or Monopoly where everyone has a specific role that they play and that they join to go ahead and act out a character of sorts. If you played D&D before, you'd be very familiar with this type of role-playing aspect to the board game, and it does make it a lot of fun. At the end of the day, Empires is what you make of it, and I'm not going to read every single thing that's on this list. There will be a link below for if you want to go ahead and read it yourself, but I'm just going to go over the rulebook today and really point out what a new player would want to know. So to keep it really precise and succinct, I'm going to start with the objective of Empires. So you want to control an empire as it attempts to conquer the land, and you're basically going to create your own species and develop them and watch as they grow, make enemies, make allies, and really ultimately you want to be the player with the most successful victory types to claim your dominion and win over the board, right? So you may be asking yourself, how as a new player do you accomplish that? Well, let's just start with the bare fundamentals. Very first thing that you're going to be asked is, hey, what sort of species do you want to create in this game? Pick up to 3 race perks that will help you achieve the victory type you want to achieve. So, as a new player, you're looking at this and you're trying to figure out what you want to do. You're trying to figure out who you want to go ahead and control. Let's look at it with a preset race that I have already created for new players, right? Now, there are several ways to win this game. Either you win it by conquering the rest of the map, building a great mighty monument of yourself that shows your economic prowess, maybe creating a shadow government and getting rid of the other players on the board, a very sneaky way to play. Maybe you're a merchant or a diplomat that is very charismatic and you want to communicate to other players, or you just want to blow everything up and start at the very beginning. Regardless of what you pick, all these victory types can be achieved through different race perks. So let's just start with the most simple one that's easy to understand. If you've played a strategy game before, you know the easiest way to win is by making it so that there's no one else on the field. Conquer Victory lets you do just that. Let's say you create a race of orcs, right? And just jumping back to the race creator real quick, these guys, they have the perk Strength, right? So the Strength race perk, I'm going to be looking down here. Oh, look at this. Costs 3 race perk points, okay? And Strength right here. Plus 3 dice roll to offense. Great. So at the cost of 3 race perk points, I am able to go ahead and take this race perk. Now, if I wanted to, I could stop right there and just decide, hey, this is my species, this is what I want their perk to be. Great. Every single faction gets 3 race points to spend for free. So right now, just with that one perk, I've spent all 3 of those race points and I can just leave it be, right? But of course, that wouldn't be interesting enough. Yeah, having plus 3 to combat is going to help us get that Conquer Victory type, but we want to do more than that as the orcs. So let's make it that we also have the Scavenger perk, all right? Now the Scavenger perk is a tier 1 perk, so I'm going to look at this. Tier 3 perk, tier 2 perk, tier 1 perk, and you'll notice that Scavenger costs an extra 1 race point. Now I don't have that as starting off, but through the use of race weaknesses, I can go ahead and balance out this race point, right? So let's take a look. Let's see what Scavenger said. Scavenger Survivalist allows me to regain any resources that are consumed when a unit dies in combat. Now I haven't explained what resources are, so you don't have to worry too much about that. Just as a new player, I'd say really pick the race perks or race weaknesses that look cool. Like, I really want you to just conceptualize what a cool species would be and what they'd be able to do. Orcs are strong, dwarves are good miners, elves are fast. Very simple stuff like that, and I can go ahead and work with you as a Fate Weaver to figure out what you want to actually do. But let's get back to the orcs real quick. So, they are scavengers, meaning that whenever they beat a unit in combat, they get their resources, or if any units of theirs die, they go ahead and keep the resources they spent to use those units. So at the end of the day, we now have 4 race perk points spent. So we need to go ahead and balance that out. We're going to get a weakness. A weakness gives you perk points back instead of spending them. So let's look at the tier 1 weaknesses. It looks like the orcs decided to go with Bloodthirsty, which makes sense for the orcs, right? So Bloodthirsty just states that every turn you must kill one enemy unit. Now, what that must means is that if you don't perform this action, you actually have what's called a riot start in your base territory. Now, we don't have to worry about what a riot is or what it does right now, just know that it's bad for you. So, as long as the orcs are constantly bloodthirsty, killing their neighbors, taking the resources it costs when their units die, and having the extra strength to succeed their dice rolls for that, they are playing the game well, right? The whole goal of the orcs is to raid everyone around you and regain armor from your fallen units, but make sure to never stop pillaging or else you'll have your own riot since the orcs are so bloodthirsty. Okay, so that's a very simple way to go about it. And again, this is all on a sheet that I've created called New Player Strategy Tips. So if you have a different objective in mind that you want to achieve, go for it, right? If you want to be sneaky, if you want to build an Annihilator, if you want to do anything like that, there are tons of races here that you can pick from just as a blueprint to start off of. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, well, do I have to pick Orc, Dwarf, Dark Elf, Human? No, you don't have to pick any of that. You get to decide yourself what the species is. So for instance, you could have a species that has strength, scavengers, and is bloodthirsty, but it's a pack of goblins, or even just some post-apocalyptic Mad Maxian humans, right? I'm gonna go ahead and scroll to the first sheet you're gonna be handed in the game. So you figured out what your species is, you want to fill it in, and boom, you get this sheet called the Empire Race Starter Sheet. So you have a specific color assigned. You've probably picked one by now already. Let's say that you're red. Your species is orc, and they are native to this land. Again, all of this is just aesthetic. It's just ways to make the game work. They don't give any inherent buffs or debuffs. It's for your story, your role-playing, right? All the rest of this is mechanics, so it's going to be things that actually affect like in-game dice rolls and how outcomes are decided. So let's say that the orcs faction name is, I don't know, the blood-crazed hooligans, right? And every time I refer to the orcs now, I say, my blood-crazed hooligans, and I send them out to battle, right? Great. You fill in the 3 race perks that you decided on, and then the optional weakness. Now, again, just going off of that, the rest of the sheet has information for you to fill in for your storytelling and your role-playing, but after you've filled out those, you're pretty set in terms of what you need to actually do to start the game. Up here, we're going to see the phases of Empires, right? This is how you actually play the game. So in Empires, there are 7 phases in total. I'm going to go over each one briefly and what you should be doing as a new player during this phase. So let's just start with the first one, the income phase. So at the very start of the game, you're going to be asked to pick out specific tiles, whether they be plains, mountains, or forests on a risk-like map. And once you place units and flags down on there, you'll actually gain income from that every single cycle, right? Now, a cycle is just a turn in the game. Once 7 phases are complete, we call that a cycle. So, starting with the very first phase, the income phase, you will gain resources from any tiles that you placed. Where do you mark those? Well, you mark those right on this handy-dandy tracker sheet. This will be the second sheet that you are handed in the game, and this just keeps track of what phase you are currently on and the amount of resources you have. Every single tile gives you 1 influence, which, if you want to think of it, it's kind of like the morale and manpower that you have in your population. And it will also give you 1 of these 3 other resources based on what the tile type is. If it's a plains, it gives you fabric. If it's a forest, it gives you wood. And if it's a mountain, it gives you ore. Along with that as well, you'll see that there are building types and placements and training and a whole bunch of different abilities that those buildings give you. Don't worry about any of this. Right now, just focus on the resources that you're gaining, and we'll continue down the phases, and eventually this will all come to light, okay? After the income phase, we reach the placement phase. So the placement phase is when you're actually going to place down your units and start doing actions. Now, you may be asking yourself, what's an action? Well, let's go ahead and go up here to the third sheet you'll be handed in Empires. This is the action sheet. So after the income phase, we go to the placement phase. And the placement phase has multiple different actions you can do in the game. Don't stress out too much about these, but the big thing you want to focus on is making sure that you have an army and you place units where you're weakest. For instance, if you have a border that is very wide and has many enemies on all sides of it, you're going to want to have units in each tile. Each tile can hold up to 5 units, right? So with all that in mind, during this phase, you're going to mark down, probably with a marker, which action you want to perform. Every single action has an influence cost to it. And if you remember from earlier, each tile gives you 1 influence. So right off the bat, you're able to spend influence to do actions, to perform things in the game, and fight your fellow players or help your fellow players, or just trade neutrally with your fellow players. During this phase specifically, you're going to be training units, moving units, and building fortresses to defend yourself from players' onslaughts. The first action is going to be training tactics. Tactics are basically abilities that your army gets during combat that you're able to use to go and stop enemies. And I've always said that a good, well-trained army is far superior over numbers, right? Now, that doesn't work every time. I mean, no single unit or single hero can be an army, right? You want to have numbers on your side, you want to train units. But if they're not well-trained, they're not going to be skilled enough to survive very long in combat. So just keep in mind that you can always train different types of tactics, and even the simplest one, Slaughter, being able to gain an extra +3 to your combat rolls, very similar to how the orcs have that as a race perk, a tier 3 race perk. Getting that during a fight really changes the outcome of your rolls, right? With that in mind as well, let's go ahead and briefly go over the different unit types just to explain what you have to roll. Empires is a D20 based system, which means every single dice roll has a 1 through 20 chance to go ahead and land, right? So when you are fighting specific types of units, you want to roll above their defense. Grunts, for instance, the lowest unit type, you can go ahead and train them at the cost of 1 fabric and 1 influence, but they only have 10 defense. Plains, fabric type tiles are the most numerous on the map. Next, we have elites that have 1 wood and 2 influence. Forests are the second most numerous, and finally followed by mountains, siege, that cost 2 ore and 2 influence. You'll notice the higher their defense goes up, the more that they cost. Of course, this is on purpose since you can only have 5 units on a battlefield. Having 5 grunts fighting 1 siege is a very intense fight because all these grunts have 10 defense. They're constantly dying like cannon fodder against the siege that you're trying to roll a 20 against. Because at the end of the day, everything costs resources, and you as a player have to decide where you want to spend those. In a similar avenue, gear cards also cost resources. Instead of influence, they cost the primary resources, the plains, the forest, or the ore. So at the cost of 2 of those, you can train a gear card. Now, just to take a quick look at gear cards, based off the type of resource that you spend is the type of gear cards you have available to you. Let's say that you have numerous forests in your territory as the orcs, and the orcs chop down these trees to go ahead and make battleships so that they can travel upstream and surprise ambush their enemies. This is a very powerful gear card that you can use at the cost of 2 wood to go ahead and create and send your orcs off to go attack other enemies. We do have a hero system in Empires, similar to D&D where heroes have proficiencies and different types of combat. You will be gaining heroes as the game goes on. In fact, at this point you've probably already gained your hero, since at the introduction of the game you gain a different unit or a different resource or a different hero based on how you perform and roleplay your first starting actions. Now, you don't have to be roleplay heavy in this game, it's just fun, honestly. It's just a way to enjoy the game more and take more out of the experience. Heroes are either proficiency trained or combat trained, meaning you'll either have a diplomat or a fighter. Now, for the orcs, I'd definitely say that their first hero would be a combat trained hero, probably their war chief. And as a fighter, the war chief, at the cost of 2 influence to use in combat, can be a warrior that gets a +10 attack roll during their fight. Now, if you've noticed, the grunts have 10 defense. This is a guaranteed kill. It's only for 1 roll, so if there's numerous grunts, they may outnumber the war chief. Again, no single hero is an army, but it's still just something fun to keep in mind. we're going to be moving on to the production phase. After you've trained your units and set up your defenses, now is the time to go ahead and increase your economy. You can find new resources, you could research different types of blueprints to help advance your empire, you could build what's known as a Titan. Now, if you remember those siege units from earlier, very expensive, but they have a lot of defense. A Titan is basically the most advanced type of unit that you can have. Think like a giant King Kong type enemy. At the cost of 6 influence and successful dice rolls, you are able to build one of these Titans to fight for you that has 20 defense and extra abilities to help them be useful in combat. Along with this phase, you'll also be able to build different buildings. Let's go ahead and take a look at the buildings real quick and just give you an idea of what each one holds. So, as a new player, here are the different district buildings you can build during this phase. You can build what I like to call the production buildings. This is your tailor, your kennel, your lumber mill, your forges, your mines. These all produce extra primary resources for you. They're one of the few buildings that do that. And instead of having to do a dice roll for those gear cards I was talking about earlier, you're actually able to get the gear card for cheaper, and it's a guarantee just by having this building. So if I build a forge or a mine on a tile, I'm able to produce this gear card. One thing to note about district buildings, though, is that you can only have 1 district per tile. At the start of the game, by default, you'll have 3 tiles, which means if you don't conquer or plan to expand, you'll only be able to build 3 different types of districts. Just something to keep in mind. So, back to the different types of building types, we also have all the influence tiered buildings. Each building has an ability tied to it. For instance, the lumber mill at the cost of 1 wood can create a gear card, and it also has an income tied to it, which in this case would be the 1 wood. So for all these influence tiered buildings, all of them give influence as a passive income, which you would gain at the start of your cycle every single turn, along with your tile income. So, the hospital builds new medicine. If you're planning to go to war, this would be something that would be very helpful for you. One thing I have to keep in mind is that the orcs have the scavenger ability. The scavenger ability means that they can regain their units' lost loot and get that back for themselves and also their enemies. However, you can only either scavenge or heal your units. Again, a lot of this is very specific and based on race types and based on race abilities, but there are a lot of niche rules. You can always ask me as the Fate Weaver and I can fill you in on how they work. But just, little things to keep in mind as we're going along is just read through the packet, get all the details that I'm not giving right now, and get a better understanding of how the game works. It really isn't as complex once you narrow down exactly what you're dealing with. So if you didn't have the scavenger race perk, for instance, you wouldn't even care about whether or not healing impacts that scavenge, right? Just something to keep in mind. There's also going to be the lab, which can make those research actions you do during that phase more powerful. The farm, which can give you unique commodities like food or weapons that you can go ahead and use to level up and equip your heroes. The theater is really fun because it actually gives you the ability to throw parties. We'll get to parties in a little bit. Mercenary hire allows you to get more troops. The jail allows you to capture units that otherwise would escape you. And the bank and marketplace actually allows you to start trading a currency. For the orcs in specific, they're going to want to pillage and raid and attack other players. The more that they can go ahead and gain from other players and attacking them, the better, but they aren't going to really be on the diplomacy side of things. So they probably wouldn't build a bank, they probably wouldn't build a theater or arena to host parties at, and they probably wouldn't make a farm unless they wanted to use it for their own heroes, just because they're going to be very self-dependent, right? But one thing I did notice was that the tavern housing does have a mercenary hire. Mercenary hire is 2 influence, or 1 ore, allows you to create 2 elites, gives you a +10 to any roll, or gives you 1 level 2 mercenary hero. So out of all of those options, you get a lot from the tavern, and you are able to produce a lot more units than they otherwise wouldn't be able to make. So I think for the orcs, building a tavern on the first turn would be an excellent choice, especially because it also gives you that +1 influence income every turn. Speaking of, if you are focusing so heavily on your economy, you could also trade resources. If you have an excess of resources or other players need specific things that only your tile provides, for instance, you could have a mountain monopoly, you could trade that ore to other players to go ahead and make it so that you can get something that you need and they can get something that they need. You are only able to trade resources during this phase, just keep that in mind, but there's always the chance to have IOUs or other types of bribes involved. One thing about trading resources that's very important to the gameplay though, especially the board game gameplay, is that you have to be very honest about it. You are trading 2 wood. No matter what, you are going to give 2 wood to them. It's not something that you say you're going to give and then they don't get it, at least during this phase. In other phases, you can say IOUs. Those are not gameplay mechanics solid. It is not something that I as a Fate Weaver back up. So you could say, hey, I owe you 2 influence outside of the production phase. That player does not have to trade those resources to you. But if they're trading it during the production phase, they absolutely have to give those resources over, no take backsies, right? But one thing that's interesting to note that does kind of put that idea on its head is the Trojan trade card. So at an added cost of 2 influence, the trade still goes through. No matter what, you're always giving them that resource. You're always giving them whatever they were promised, right? But you are now able to go ahead and make this empire distracted. Now, we'll talk more about what Distracted does later, but basically Distracted causes an empire to be very susceptible to subterfuge and sneaking around and assassinating. Now, the orcs aren't very good at subterfuge. I'd say that they're more focused on army and troop movement and placement, so they probably would be pretty honest with their trades if they had an ally. But on the off chance that they did want to sabotage or assassinate somebody because they're not good at actual just upfront subterfuge, this would be a great way for the orcs to get those off, right? The story phase is where the roleplay aspect of Empires gets very heavy. It's actually a very, very fun experience to kind of be able to do whatever you want. In story, you create a hero that thrives in your empire and does actions to either help or harm other fellow empires and players. So this hero goes around, and for instance, the Orc War Chief could give a rallying speech to his allies before a big fight, or maybe he goes out to be one of the first orc negotiators to communicate with a human player nearby. Creating these really interesting and unique story beats, maybe even having character arcs, is a really big plus for me in my games. It's all optional, and it's all based off the playgroup you have, but I always have a better experience when players are doing stuff like this. And you can just see there's a lot to do with a custom story action. Basically anything can be done, you just have to ask your FW. And in the off chance that I don't have any ideas or you're a new Fate Weaver to Empires, you can always roll the d20 to go ahead and randomly generate a quest. The next phase is the scouting phase. So during the scouting phase, it's a lot like the story phase. We have our story beats, we have our mentions of heroes and how they work, but this phase is really when heroes travel around the map. Instead of doing inward, empire focused, your own faction stuff, you're gonna be interacting with the world. So let's say, for instance, there is what's called a point of interest on the map, right? A POI. And this POI contains a quest in it to go ahead and pull the sword out of the stone. Classic quest, right? The thing is, the Orc War Chief goes to explore, and he's the one that actually successfully pulls the sword out of the stone, even as one of the human princelings comes along and attempts to go ahead and do it himself, right? Now, yes, the sword is still stuck in the stone, and he's using it more as a war club, but that's still a really fun and interesting story beat. Points of interest are dotted around the map. There's usually about 4 of them that are connected to different quest lines. In Empires currently, we actually have an overarching world quest that's happening. Just to give you a brief look at them right now, currently this is the world map of what's happening in Empires. Every single one of these squares was a different game that we had in the game. We played it out, and at the end of it, one of these 3 major world powers, the Striker Liberation, the Assembly of Nations, or the Genusian Collective, kind of take over and gain control of that map. The goal is to one day host a mega game that has all the different factions of all these different empires coming together to fight. And what that means in the real world is me begging my friends to come over and hang out for a bit and just, reconnect with old buddies of mine. And it's just a fun excuse to get together. We call this the nostalgia games. But yeah, Going back to the different types of scouting actions, during the scouting phase, not only can you explore POIs, you can also attend and host parties of other players. Now, I mentioned it earlier with the Trojan trade. Attending a party makes your empire distracted. It makes them very susceptible to subterfuge. Think Game of Thrones, Red Wedding, right? Anything like that can always have little sneaky tie-ins to it. But anybody that attends a party, if it is truly just a party or a festival, surface level, they gain 1 influence per empire that attends. So 5 players attend a party, that's 5 influence, which is a lot of money, right? A lot of resources for everybody. To host a party, you have to have 1 commodity. You can either get this by building a farm or by, raiding and pillaging and taking a commodity from someone else, which the orcs, they might just host a festival for themselves just to get that extra influence. Who knows, right? Moving on to subterfuge, we have assassinate, sabotage, stealing, and guard patrols. Now, this I'm going to go over pretty briefly, but during the subterfuge phase, you are able to do all these actions, and you're also able to build traps. Traps are kind of like hidden fortifications that you have in your own base. Whenever another player walks over it, it blows up minefield style and causes them to lose units during the combat phase. Traps are a good investment, but honestly, sometimes they aren't triggered at all throughout the entirety of the game, so just make sure that you are a player who is going to be attacked at endgame if you're going to go crazy on traps. I'd say that the orcs would rather just have units there instead of traps, right? Assassinate as a first action allows you to attack and kill units without having to go to combat. It's useful to clear tiles of very tricky units, for instance a siege. Sieges usually have 20 defense, but if you're a subterfuge-focused faction, that 20 defense is now 15. And depending on how high of a subterfuge bonus roll you get, that 15 could get knocked down to 13, to 10, to 12. You get what I'm saying. Along with that, we have the sabotage action. This is basically like your spies snuck in and burnt down a granary in the middle of the night, or opened up a wall to go ahead and allow your units to walk through. Just, little fun scenes like that. It destroys any buildings that are on the tile and also destroys fortifications on the tile. Not traps, but just fortifications like a wall or a rampart. Along with that, we also have the steal or spread action. Now, I've labeled it as both because for a long time in Empires, if you play this game for long enough, you'll realize it has a huge history of about like 6 years of games and updates. But basically, influence is a stand-in for population and wealth and economy for your people, right? So the spread followers action could be seen as propaganda, like you're spreading propaganda in someone's territory and their people are starting to believe what you're telling them, right? Which causes that empire to lose influence and for you to gain influence. If you do a steal action, although it costs you 1 influence, you also have the opportunity to gain 2. So essentially gaining a free influence just for doing this. And you can also use unique resources to do that instead. There is a whole list of unique resources that you have here, but ones that are very common and we brought up earlier, the farm, the commodity, right? Food is a unique resource. Medicine from the hospital to heal your units is a unique resource. Poison to poison the enemy or set up poison traps is a unique resource. And just to take note, poison can also be used in assassinate. A lot of these systems tie into each other, and oftentimes there isn't one answer fits all to different problems that you have in the game. What I find really fun about Empires is you can kind of ad-lib what your actions are as you keep going, and that's always just a very unique thing I found in this game. And of course, if you don't want all of this stuff to happen to you, let's do a guard patrol. Guard patrol at the cost of 1 influence. It allows you to go ahead and stop most subterfuge actions that are performed against you as long as you get a pretty decent high dice roll. If you roll a 15, for instance, on a guard patrol, it's a 15 plus a 5. It makes it so all of these have to be rolled 20, right? Now, of course, that's not taking into consideration if they have a subterfuge bonus. For instance, if they took the sneaky perk, they get a +3 to subterfuge, which would make it now a 17 instead of a 20 that they have to roll, but I digress. Guard patrols are nice because if you have the extra influence and you have the extra manpower to spend to actually send guard patrols out and defend your territory, you can catch some pretty sneaky players on the back end. So it's a good action to do. I would never say that you have to do it every cycle, but if you know someone's being suspicious and you suspect them of assassinating or doing other actions to you, I would definitely do a guard patrol. The most exciting one here, Phase 7, Combat. So during combat, there are a lot of different ways to affect other players and make them lose territory or make them lose units. For the orcs, this is going to be their bread and butter. The orcs could go to war, which means that if they win a fight, it allows them to claim a tile from another player, physically taking it from them and moving into their territory. If it's a pillage action, the orcs are more just raiding, ambushing, looting, and then disappearing back to their homes. Still a very powerful way to attack. If there's a neutral tile that hasn't yet been claimed by a player, this doesn't happen often, but sometimes on larger maps that have multiple tiles, there may be 1 or 2 spots open. If you can, always go for a claim tile. It's just more resources and more possibilities for you to build more buildings. There is always the chance of you spreading yourself too thin, but in the orcs case, I think that they wouldn't care about that because they just want to take as much land as they can. And of course, the antithesis to most of this is the truce. The cost of 1 influence, you can go ahead and befriend other members, other factions around the table, and make it so that unless they spend 5 influence, they can't betray you. They can't attack you. Truces are nice because they're very good for saying, hey, you and I are allies of sorts right now. They also are really fun for when players do decide to betray. It is a crazy amount of resource cost, but dang, does it pull off some surprise endings in the game. Now, just how to win the game, actual winning of empires. You've done all these phases, you've gone through all of them, it will repeat itself about 2 or 3 times, and you'll have about 2 or 3 turns while doing these actions to go ahead and claim your dominancy and decide which one of these victory types you want to go for. Now, I've already gone over the victory types. Like I said, the orcs are going for the conquer victory. In order to get that, the orcs have to win 2 fights on the offensive against another player. So let's say turn 1, they declared a war, and turn 2, they did a pillage on another player. Maybe they made a truce with the human king because technically they're the king now, even though the humans would never accept that. The orcs kind of have a good humor about it, and they convince that player, hey, we should be buddies. And that human player does decide to go ahead and do that with them. So now the orcs conquer most of the rest of the map. They take over territory, and at endgame, this last little extra phase at the end of the cycles, the orcs push out with their war chief to go attack everyone. But little do they know, the heroes, not the heroes, but the humans were going for the assimilate victory. So they have a shadow government inside of the orcs' territory already set up to attack them. The orcs were not prepared for this, and even though they were in a truce, truces just state that you can't directly attack a player. It never said anything about setting up spies and assassins in the orcs' territory. So, while the orc war chief sleeps, they send in an assassin to kill him. It creates an epic last-moment battle as the orc war chief wakes up, wielding the war club, and tries to fend off the assassins, but ultimately, he's poisoned and dies. And that's kind of how a game would pan out, honestly. The different victory types go in this order of victory. If you build an annihilator, it destroys everyone else. It's like you built a nuke and just nuked the surrounding territory. So if you did a conquer victory, even if those spies succeeded in killing the war chief, it still means that they beat the spies. They destroy the territory that the spies were sent from. And at that point, the conquerors win. The diplomacy victory would win over the conquer victory because ultimately you can't attack somebody that's so influential like that. So because the orcs got the map victory type of achieving the sword in the stone and got the conquer victory type, even though their war chief leader died, ultimately they won the game. What does this mean? It means that they are the ones who get to decide what their epilogue looks like. What they really want to do is probably look at the human player and cause him to go through immense conquering and destruction, but the truth is they also achieved a unique victory type called Team Victory. So Team Victory makes it so that you can't force any sort of victory type on the other players, which means that the truce still remains, which means the orcs cannot take vengeance on the humans. They're just too ingrained in the orc society. Again, this is only considering that the orcs don't conquer and destroy the humans as they snuck in. There's a lot of different variables here. Endgame is complicated but fun. I would say it's probably the most complicated part of Empires. But at the end of the day, you're just trying to have fun. I wouldn't say overthink all this stuff and always go for the win if it means sacrificing your fun. I would definitely prefer that players actually have a good time, which which is why I always have this optional rulings sheet here. If you ever want to take a look at what I accept and don't accept at my tables, you can always take a look here. I'm just trying to provide a unique experience. I think this really does help, and any new player that takes a look at this will have a better time for their first session. So until next time, guys, may your empires stand tall and your victory reign supreme. Happy world building.